As a teenager, I taught myself programming, but not very effectively. So what would happen is I would sit down for maybe 2 or 3 hours at a time, trying to teach myself a new concept, but it would never really result in anything. I'd end up coming out of the other end of that study session feeling exhausted, burnt out, annoyed, stressed, and worst of all, I didn't actually learn anything. And this was a pattern that continued across my education throughout my teenage years and early adulthood. But all of this changed when I decided to change my career path. So at the age of 21, I decided that I would switch my career path from programming to medicine. But there was quite a few obstacles in my way. I wasn't traditionally academic, I had no qualifications, and worse yet, I didn't really have any academic record at all. I didn't actually know that I could even study these things. So this led me to researching how people get good grades. And what I found is that high-ranking students use an abundance of different studying techniques to get their good grades. And the one that really stood out to me the most was the Pomodoro Technique. The Pomodoro Technique is where you study for half an hour at a time with 10-minute breaks in between. There are variations on these times. For instance, sometimes it's 25 minutes and then a 3-minute break or a 5-minute break. That is mostly up to your discretion. But the theory behind the Pomodoro Technique is the focus and diffuse modes of your brain. So focus mode is basically your flow state. That's when your brain can focus on one thing at high intensity for an extended period of time. And this is where most of learning occurs. This is where, you begin to understand everything and things sort of just like fall together. But then you also have diffuse mode. And this is actually a very important part of the learning process. While focus mode is used to take in information, diffuse mode is used to process it. So this is activated pretty much any time you're not doing anything cognitively intense. So, if you're maybe taking a walk, grabbing a tea, whatever that might be, anything where you're not actively engaging in something cognitively intense, your brain is in diffuse mode, and that's when it processes everything you've learned. And that's very important because that's where your brain ends up starting to remember things and put all these concepts that you've learned together. So having learned all this about the Pomodoro Technique, I decided that I would deploy it in maths. So at the time, my maths grades were terrible. In fact, I hated maths. I always hated it growing up, and I knew that maths would probably be my biggest barrier into medical school. So I knew I needed to start with maths. So I thought the Pomodoro Technique would be a very good way into tackling my problems with maths. So for the first week, I didn't really get much benefit from it. It would take me around 20 minutes to get into a flow state, and by then I only had 10 minutes left in my Pomodoro anyway, and it kind of felt a bit pointless because it would just disrupt my flow and I just couldn't focus properly using it. But I kept at it anyway because maths was a subject I hated so much that the less time that I spent at it in one go, the better. The second week is where things began to change. And this is when I started to notice that it was a lot easier to start working. And this was because I was starting to recognize that I wasn't going to sit down for 2 or 3 hours at a time. I was going to sit down for half an hour and then take a break. And that made it easier to start studying. And because it made it easier to start studying, it made it easier to focus and get into a flow state. By now, I could get into a flow state within 5 or 10 minutes. And this meant that I could dedicate the rest of my time in the Pomodoro to actually focusing on the problems at hand and learning all the new concepts I needed to cover. So fast forward a year from this point, and I used it everywhere. So when I started studying maths and science at college, I used it 24/7 during that time in my revision. It got to a point where I was actually studying for 4 hours a day, and the Pomodoro Technique made that effortless. It made it a lot easier to start because I always knew there was only 30 minutes to do. And the beauty of doing your studying in 30-minute slots is that you can split it up however you like. You could do an hour in the morning, an hour and a half in the afternoon, and then maybe an hour and a half again in the evening. This also allowed me to have a life even in the height of exam season. Because I was splitting up my study sessions into smaller chunks, that meant I could just kind of throw them around different times in the day and do more or less what I wanted in between. And one big thing I noticed by studying this way was that my progress was much more consistent and of higher quality. I would take in things more clearly, it would be faster to learn things, and I actually enjoyed doing what I was doing. But perhaps the biggest benefit of all for me was the fact that I wasn't burning myself out anymore. Before the Pomodoro Technique, I noticed that revision would always burn me out. By the end of the day, I would feel absolutely exhausted and I'd end up finding it very difficult because of that the next day to start again. Thanks to the Pomodoro Technique, I never felt that. By the end of the day, I might feel just a little bit stressed or maybe even a little bit tired if it was particularly intense, but for the most part, I felt fine. So the Pomodoro Technique is still something I use today and I absolutely love it. It has enabled me to do so much that I would never be able to do without it. And obviously the massive benefits to what I've just summarized there is that the Pomodoro Technique provided me a way to study with less friction. The less friction there is with your studying, the easier it will be to do and the higher quality it will also be. Because of this, what tends to happen after a while when you use the Pomodoro Technique over a sustained period of time is that it becomes a part of your routine. You don't even really think about doing them. And because of that, you can sort of learn to look at your day in blocks of Pomodoros. You can just sort of look at it one Pomodoro at a time. So rather than thinking, oh my God, I need to study 4 hours a day, you end up getting into the habit of thinking, right, let's just tackle this day with just one Pomodoro and just see where we go. And then eventually what happens is after the first Pomodoro, you start getting in your stride, and then second, third, fourth, it gets easier and easier and easier as you go through the day. And again, just to reiterate on the burnout issue, because you're only studying in half-an-hour blocks and you're giving yourself a 10-minute break in between each block, you're making absolutely sure that you're not pushing through burnout. Because what can happen is if you study for 2 or 3 hours, probably by about an hour in, you're starting to feel pretty tired, maybe a bit stressed, and then you're using more and more willpower as you go. And the more willpower you're using, the more you're burning yourself out, the more emotional fuel you're spending trying to convince yourself to keep going. Whereas with the Pomodoro technique, it removes that from the equation almost entirely. Sure, you have to psych yourself up a little bit, but the amount that you have to do that is tiny because you know you only have to do it in 30-minute blocks. And because of this, you're never going to end up getting into a situation where you're really pushing hard through a lot of stress or, using a lot of willpower to keep going because, again, you're studying for a short period of time and then you're having a 10-minute break. And that also brings me, again, to the point that because you're studying in such small chunks, it gives you the flexibility to fit other things around it. That means you can still have a life, you can still go out, you can still, see your friends, you can go out for a walk anytime you like, you can use those as your breaks. You can spread these Pomodoros across a whole day without it interrupting with your lifestyle, which is a massive plus because obviously a healthy lifestyle and an active lifestyle outside of studying is also a very important part of studying well. And one last thing I wanted to mention with the Pomodoro technique as well is that it teaches you the value of breaking challenges down into small steps. Because we live in a society now where we only ever get to see the highlight reels of people's lives and the highlight reels of, years worth of work. And it can kind of reduce people's big goals into, one very short journey when actually 9 times out of 10, it's a very long and laborious task to even get to that stage in the first place. This is what the Pomodoro technique has taught me. It's taken a really massive task like, the aspiration of getting into medical school without any qualifications into smaller steps that were actually quite workable and easy to get through. And now as a result, I'm very close to doing my Access to Medicine course in September. So it's really helped me break down a very big goal into small and approachable pieces. Thank you for watching the video, and if you like this video, please give it a like. If you want to see more of my content in the future, please subscribe, and I will see you soon.